Hello. In this video, we are going to look at how you can create a C# console application and use it from SSIS. One thing to note is that this is a complex process and it would require some additional training to understand how to create C# applications. There are additional videos out there and, of course, lots of training available for free that you can look this up if you're interested. But in this video, our goal is to just get the basic understanding of how things work and how it can be achieved. Let's get started. In the previous video, we used a C# script task, or should I say an SSIS script task with C#. I'm going to disable that and enable a different task. This is a execute process task. This shows up over here. Execute process task, in which case I drug it onto the surface and then pointed it to a executable. Now that executable has to be made, and once it's made, I go through and I put it in data to process, the data to process folder, but it's currently not there yet, so we're going to wait and put it in there. The executable can be made by going over to the solution, right-clicking on the solution icon, choosing Add New Project. And when this dialog window appears, choosing to make a C# Windows console application. I've already done that, and this is what I have. You get a single file when you make one of these called program, and very similar to what we saw in the SSIS script task, there will be a blocked out main method. Let me walk you through this process a little bit, comment that out. So all the code is going to start from the main method, and the first thing we're going to do is write out a local function local to my little application that is called test_is_valid. Now, if I scroll up here, let me collapse these. I can see a method called isValid, in which case I use that same code as we saw previously, making a regular expression pattern, examining whether or not it's a match, and if it's successfully matched, return true or false. No, excuse me, return true if it's successful, false if it's not. Very similar code to what we were using previously. My test_is_valid just calls that method on various different pieces of data. So this one's a correct email address, but the other ones are missing a @ symbol, missing the name, missing the domain, or missing the .com part. Those are all issues that could come up. I'm now going to run this application. I'll do so by first going over to Solution Explorer and making sure that it is the startup project. The startup project shows up in bold, and as we can see, the SSIS script task is in bold, which means that if I try to run this, let me put a breakpoint here and try to go ahead and debug it, start debugging. It says 1 succeeded as far as the build, but nothing seemed to happen in here. The reason for that is it has to be the startup project. When it's in bold and I do the exact same step, you can see that it actually pauses there and allows me to walk through the code. Step into, and now it comes up here and starts running my code, validating these emails. The first one is a success, true, and as such I return true. But the next one is unsuccessful, and as such it never returns true, It just returns false. As you can see, the debugging process is similar to what we saw in SSIS. Now we'll take a look at another technique that people use on a regular basis. That's creating yet another project. Let me comment this out. But this time, the project is going to be a dynamic link library project. The way this is done is I create another project. Right-click on the solution, add, new project. Still C#, still Windows, but this time I want a class library. The class library will create a DLL. The class library application, which I called Email Validator, does not have a user interface. It just has a collection of classes. In this case, there's only one class. It's called Email Validator. It's in a namespace I called My Email Validator, just to make it clear that it was something different than the class name. Doesn't have to be different, but to make it easier on the video. I have the exact same code as before. The isValid method was just copy and paste, but now it's in a different file. Down below, you'll see I have another example of the isValid. Almost the same code, a little bit different. I'm going to be using that later on in this module to show how a common language runtime stored procedure can be used. So we'll ignore that for right now. In order for the DLL to be created, I have to right-click on it and tell it to, actually I'll left-click on it so you can see it in the menu, tell it to build. This will create the DLL. Once the DLL is created, I can reference it from my console application under References by adding a reference to that project in the solution. What that'll do is it'll copy the DLL over to the location where the exe will be made for my console application. To do that, I will also build my console application. Then I'll go down into the folder, View folder in File Explorer, look in the Binaries folder, under the Debug folder, and I'll find my executable. I also find a copy of that Email Validator DLL. Those two files need to both be copied over and placed in a folder if I want to reference it and use them from SSIS. We'll do that in just a minute. So you can create a package that we use that executable. And let me show you a little bit more about that executable before we move on. Here's an additional option. This is the one I'm using, that common language runtime stored procedure, just to validate that it actually works. Notice that I call my namespace, the class name, and then the method. And I'm using an output parameter like I do with SQL Server. So an input parameter and an output parameter. And I'll display the result to a string. And when I run this, it looks like when I clicked around on the left-hand side, it changed the focus back to the SSIS project. This does happen. Let's see, startup project. We'll try that again. It's one of those that happen on a regular basis. Oops, excuse me. And it's actually a good thing for you to see. So you can see it's running. I'm getting back an integer value instead of true and false. 0 would be false, 1 would be true. So I'm going to, again, demonstrate that later on in SQL using a common language runtime stored procedure. Right now, though, that's how that works. Comment that out, and I'll show you how I can actually read data from a text file. So breakpoint here, and run it again. To read the data from the text file, I made a new method I call test reading from a text file. In this case, I will go through and make a stream reader object that points to my email data file. I make an empty variable to hold my line data. And let's see, I have that counter, but I still don't need. Let me take that out. And actually, let me stop it because I need to when I run it again, it'll rebuild the executable, and I want to rebuild it with my correct code. Okay, let's try it again. So opens a stream reader, or makes a new stream reader. And then when I call read line, I will go ahead and open the connection. Read the content of that first line. And then write it out to the console window. Hard to see here. And then keep doing it until I'm running out of data. So you can see that it's quite easy to read through that text file using C#. Let's look at expanding on this code. So I'm going to add to it. What I want to do is I want to add my validation logic to it. You may remember that I first tested to make sure that the validation logic was working. I also tested it was working from a DLL. I then go through and test the functions in the DLL using both a valid and is valid with integer. And then after that, I've gone through and written some code to make sure that I could read from the text file with my test reading. Now, I'll just combine those in this new function, in which case, let me start it up. It's real estate there. Comes up here, same code as before, opens the stream reader, but this time it calls the isValid function, or method. So every time it gets the data, one row of data, it goes through and validates it. When it comes back, in this case, it just keeps going. So you can see it's really easy to add on additional functionality. There's one more layer that's important to us, though. I've got that working. I want to do this. I want to, when it's valid, write it to a valid file. When it's invalid, write it to an invalid file. I will do that by just going over here and running this again. So now the code goes through, makes 3 strings to hold the file to the path and the name of the 3 files. One is the email data, one's the valid email data, and the other the invalid email data. And I just go through and use a stream reader to read the data, a stream writer to write the data. I'll read the data out, run it through my isValid method. Let me step over this, excuse me. That way I don't have to look at the code again. If it comes back as valid, then it'll go ahead and write the data to the valid file. If invalid, it'll write it to the invalid file. So this is going to skip over that next line. Oops, let me step out. And write it to the invalid file, because that second row was invalid. And it will keep doing so until it processes them all. Looking on my hard drive, I can see that the new files were made for me with valid and invalid data. Very similar to what we did in the previous video, where we just used the C# code in the script task, but this time I've actually walked you through the various steps of writing the code and testing it. Again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive tutorial on how to create C# applications by any means, but it hopefully gives you an idea of how you would kind of tackle it piece by piece, starting off with getting some validation logic to work, testing that validation logic, trying to test it out with the maybe a DLL if you want to use that, reading from a text file, validating the data you read from the text file, and finally writing that data into separate files. Actually, to tell you the truth, really, I only need the last one and the isValid one in order for it all to work. Once the application has been created and tested, I would now need to copy the resulting executable, and if I'm using a DLL alongside of it, the DLL. So I will come over, open the folder, find the bin folder, copy that exe and the DLL, and put it someplace convenient. In this case, my data to process folder. With that in place, I can come over to my SSIS package, make sure that it's pointing to the correct location. Have it run that code, which will then go ahead and write the valid and invalid data to those text files. Then create the staging table like we saw before. I didn't change anything there, and load it into the SQL database. Let's take a look at the contents of those two tables right now. In the right database here. There we go. I'm going to clear those out. So I will delete from, and then the name of my table. I'll do that for both of them. With the tables empty, we can now go back to our SSIS project, right-click on the package, and execute it. We come back over here and look again, you can see that it worked. From that demonstration, you can see that it's pretty easy to create a .NET executable file that can go out and do amazing things. In this case, what we saw was not that amazing, but it was still practical. These applications can be used to interact with the internet, your network, Exchange server, or any other email server, lots of different things. Really, it's almost limited by your imagination. Learning how to create these applications is not that difficult to get started. As most things, it's more difficult to master. But you'd be surprised what you can do with just a small amount of training. I would encourage you to take a look at that if you found this an interesting option. And we're going to continue our discussion about options in the next video. I'll see you there.